We finished Acts chapter 1 last week. We have done the introduction. We have added Matthias to our number, and all things are now ready. Before we begin into chapter 2, as I mentioned last week, we're going to take a little tour of Jerusalem. So many things that we're going to study in the book of Acts as we get to it are going to transpire in and around the temple, especially early on, and then coming back to it when we get to Acts chapter 21, when Paul's going to be arrested just outside the walls of the temple. So we're going to take a look at these places and kind of familiarize ourselves with them and be able to kind of recollect in our minds as these things transpire, where they're transpiring, and the areas concerning them. So real quick, open up your New Testaments to John chapter 2. Gospel of John chapter 2. Early in the ministry of Jesus, even before he migrates north to Galilee to begin his ministry early on, Jesus is going to cleanse the temple for the very first time. He's going to do this more than once, but he is going to cleanse the temple in verses 13 down through verse 22. And at these events, Jesus is going to be asked about a sign. Verse 18 says, "And the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign do you show to us, seeing that you do these things?' And Jesus answered and said in verse 19 to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.'" Now we know, looking back with perfect sight, John's even going to share that he was talking about himself. But note verse 20. "Then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?'" Now here we have a little bit of a time snippet that's worth paying attention to. Is that this is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, at approximately 30 years old. This means somewhere between 13 and 16 years before the coming of the Lord in the flesh, his physical birth. Herod's going to begin the construction of the temple. And this is a reconstruction. As we know, we studied Nehemiah not too long ago. We remember that Babylon destroyed the temple, and then Zerubbabel went back and they began the reconstruction then, and it was a limited reconstruction. It's pretty safe to say that the temple never resumed its glory as in the days of Solomon, but Herod was determined to win favor with the Jews by rebuilding the temple. And he started, and it was a very expensive endeavor. It was one that was going to take him a great deal of time, effort, negotiation, money, all these things in order to reconstruct this temple. And as we see, he's 46 years into it here in John chapter 2, and it's still not done, and it won't be done even to its destruction in 70 AD. It won't be completely finished. However, for the most part, he has secured, once again, precious stones, and we're gonna learn how we know that here in a minute. And he's going to reconstruct at least the heart of and the majority of the temple. Now, I've chosen this artist's rendition of the temple complex here. So just to give you an idea of scale, it's a fairly well done scale. In a minute, we're going to take a look at a actual scale model of the city built in the Museum of Israel. We'll take a look at it here in just a little bit. But it gives you an idea of the scale with what the artist pictures as people in there. Josephus records that at the time of Passover and Pentecost, there could be anywhere, Passover being the largest number, down to a smaller number at Pentecost, anywhere from 3.5 million to 1.5 million people in this complex for Passover and Pentecost. That's a lot of folks. Go ahead, Mary. Okay. Actually, north would be up here. We're looking at the temple from the southwest, looking northeast from corner to corner. This top of Mount Olives would be virtually due east, and then west would be this side going this way. Now, we're going to have some better pictures of that in a minute, but yes. So we would be looking at it, and you bring up a good point. Another reason I chose this picture to start with is you notice that the temple's being portrayed as being bright white. Well, the stone that the temple was rebuilt with, even Herod rebuilt with, was trying to mimic Solomon's temple, which was made out of marble and white limestone. White. Literally, the sun would come up over the top of the Mount of Olives, hit the temple at about 9 a.m., and the building literally glowed. And if you're coming at Jerusalem in the direction we are, but further out, say 20 miles even from the city, you could see the temple on the hill. We're going to take a look at the fact that it sits on a hill in a minute. You could see it on the hill, and you could see that white glowing from a distance, giving the impression that God was in his house. The impression. I want to make sure we're clear about that. Okay. But that just gives you an idea of why they were trying to reconstruct it back to the idea of Solomon in its days. By the way, good reading, 1 Kings chapter 5 through chapter 7 is the construction of the temple by Solomon. Solomon had all the stones for the temple building cut outside the city. He had them brought in and placed in the temple complex, built there in silence. No construction in the city at all. He brought them in and put them in there in silence so worship wouldn't be disturbed during the construction. Interestingly enough, the cornerstone, which is always the first stone cut, and the capstone were cut at the same time, and the building perfectly fit together. Who gave Solomon that knowledge? God. Absolutely. The ability to construct in that fashion. Good. Well, Herod's trying to reconstruct this, and the materials would be much the same. It would be much the same looking. I would dare say that the city, more than the temple complex, the city is much larger than it would have been in the days of Solomon. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. But as I mentioned, let's take a look at a couple of scriptures to know how we know that the temple was being constructed much like it was in the days of Solomon. Turn over to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. Take a look at verse 1. Now, chapter 23 of Matthew, you might remember, is an oral indictment by the Lord against the scribes and the Pharisees. And this oral indictment was rather straightforward, rather brutal, rather harsh. He's going to call literally exactly their sins right in front of them to their face in the presence of his disciples. He's going to say, hypocrites 7 times, woe to you 8 times. Blind guides, he's going to call them twice. He's going to call them blind once. Fools and blind, he's going to call them twice. And he's going to call them vipers. I think we mentioned this, might have mentioned it a couple weeks ago. What's unique about a viper? It's an ambush predator. It's meant to fit right in and look like everything else that's good and wholesome, like the flora on the ground, but you step down and it bites you. He calls them that right to their faces, if you can imagine the insult. Verse 37 and 39 of 23, Jesus makes this statement, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem." And you have to love the words here. The one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, what? Desolate. Now note whose house it is now. You ever pay attention that when the kids are in trouble, parents switch them back and forth? You know what your son has done, your daughter's done. Well, did you notice what Jesus did here? It's not God's house anymore. Whose house is it? Your house. And it's left to you desolate. God's not there anymore. And he's not there because he doesn't want to be there. He's there because you left him. It's important to pay attention to that, isn't it? Your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Chapter 24, we kind of change, and it goes starts in verse 1. It says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple." Now in a minute, I have a view of it where you're going to be able to see the temple from the Mount of Olives as if you're sitting with Jesus as his disciples was on the Mount of Olives looking down into it. At this moment, where they're going to ask him about the buildings. And Jesus said to them in verse 2, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon the other that shall not be thrown down." Now let's turn over and let's add Mark's account to this. Mark chapter 13 and verse 1. Mark chapter 13 and verse 1. Same situation, same placing. Mark's just going to add some more imagery, if you will, add to the story so we get a better picture. In Mark 13 verse 1 it says, "And as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here.'" Now why are they calling out the stones? Herod's trying to rebuild it. He's using precious stones. Peter's going to make a play on this, by the way, in 1 Peter chapter 2. Knowing that his audience knows well the stones used in the temple, he's going to talk about the fact that they are a temple. They are precious stones in God's temple. Not an earthly temple, but a temple made of us. God's house. Okay? Built on the cornerstone, which is Jesus Christ. Jesus answered and said to them, verse 2, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." Even Jesus recognizes that the buildings are done up nice, right? Let's add one more view to this. Go to Luke chapter 21. Let's take a look at, verse 7. Actually, verse 5. Luke 21, verse 5. "And as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts, he said, 'As for these things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" And here, if we add all the accounts together, we see that Herod has been putting together a rather beautiful reconstruction of the temple. Go ahead, Mary.
Those walls that are up there, so I know the temple, and then you've got, I'm assuming, the courtyard, like the tabernacle in the inner area. These big walls around, and I guess this is the market on this end. Is that the Torah on this end?
Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, but go ahead. No, you're fine. Let's do a couple of things since Mary's brought that up before I move into the actual pictures. Okay? How much of Jerusalem's left for us to investigate? How much of ancient Jerusalem's left? Good, Kathy. None. Zero. There's one little piece of a wall that many of them worship at that they believe was part of the actual temple wall. But we don't really have it, do we? The construction that we're going to look at, the actual scale model of the city that's been done rather well, by the way, but is only done based on what history we have. Based on the writings of Josephus, based on some of the writing of some of the rabbinical leaders of the day. Basically, all they have to work with is history. A Sabbath day's journey, how many paces did we talk about that was last week? 2,000 paces. They say we could go from this part of the city to this part of the city in Sabbath day's journey. You could space off and know that it was about that far from here to there, etc. We don't have the actual city to look at. Everything that we have here, whether it's the artist rendition or the model, is based off of the imagery that can be determined from the history. So, the walls, here's what I'll tell you about the walls, first and foremost. The walls of the temple were far more superior than the walls of the city. We know that because in Josephus' rendition of the destruction of Jerusalem, the Romans are going to actually take the northern walls which, by the way, if you go this way, the northern walls, the northern part of the city expanded out so much greater than the original city to the north. They're going to take the northern walls, and then the inner wall that was the old wall, they're going to take those two walls out before attacking this side of the temple. It's going to take them almost 3 times as much time to take that wall next to the temple than it took them to take the 2 outer walls. As well defended as the others were, it's still going to take them that much longer, because that's how much better the walls to the temple were constructed, even in the reconstruction. So they are much greater walls than the outer walls of the city, and we know that based on that understanding. But in terms of the actual heights and depths and so forth, we don't really have an exact idea. These are the temple walls you're looking at here. We're going to look at the city walls, and you'll be able to discern the difference here in just a minute. So here's another picture of the temple, just to give us familiarity with the temple itself. So real quick, this right here would be the east. This would be the west. Remember, the temple always opens to the rising of the sun, okay, by design. And as the sun rises, it's the imagery of God coming into his home or his house. This would be the southern wall. This would be the northern wall. We see on the outside what's known as the court of the Gentiles. Did the court of the Gentiles exist in the days of Solomon? No. Proselytization was something that was born during the 400 years of silence. Gentiles up to that point were not allowed in the temple unless you had been, what's the word I want to say? Say it? Well, except for they didn't call it that under the old law. It was the law of the stranger. The law of the stranger, the strangers came into Israel, and they came to know the one true God, and they wanted to stay there, and they wanted to serve God, and they wanted to be part of the people. Well, the first person that wanted that would be recognized, but it wouldn't be until the 5th generation, good Kathy, the 5th generation, then he would be given a tribe and an identity among the people and be assimilated, that's the word I was looking for, assimilated into the people. Thus, he would not be a Gentile, he would be of the children of Israel, based on the law of the strangers, they called it. Okay? With that understanding, there wasn't any Gentiles. Proselytization did not come until the Jews dispersed, and they didn't all return. They stayed in the dispersion. And because of the dispersion, they were worried that in these foreign areas, they would lose their identity. So they began synagogue worship. There's no command in the Old Testament for synagogue worship. Synagogues were born during the 400 years of silence. They began synagogue worship, and then as Gentiles became aware of the one true God through their teaching, through their sharing about him, they wanted to serve God. Well, they were circumcised, but they were no longer assimilated like the people in the law of the strangers. Now they were proselytized, meaning that they were allowed to worship God, but they were treated like second-class citizens. You stayed at the back of the synagogue. You were allowed in the outer courts of the temple. You still had to be circumcised. You couldn't come in uncircumcised, but you were treated like a second-class citizen in this process. And so proselytization never met the heart that the law of the strangers was designed for, nor did it meet the intent of staying in the land that God gave them in order to serve him, to be different, to be separate from the other nations. So we see all this, whether synagogue worship or proselytization, we've seen this born in the minds of who? Men. Good. Not in the minds of God, nor was it his intent. But as we look at the temple, just a couple more things. This eastern gate, coming from the brook Kidron, up there's a set of stairs that comes up to this side. This was often the gate that the apostles would enter the temple because it was faster coming from the southern part of the city to go out and up the side of the wall here than it was to come up through the city into these. This is a staircase here and a staircase that enters from the bottom, and there's one on this side and one on this side, but it was quicker to come that way. We also see in Acts chapter 3 that it would be through this door and right here, right by these steps at the gate called Beautiful. This is the gate called Beautiful, the entrance to the temple that we have the man begging alms that's going to be completely healed in Acts chapter 3 by Peter, or actually by the Lord in his name. Basically, everybody knew him. He's going to be healed. He's going to walk into the porticos, which is this area right over here. He's going to walk in with them, and everybody's going to see him walking, and they're going to come to see, and now you have a ready-made audience for them to preach to. And they're going to preach the second gospel sermon in Acts chapter 3. Now the porticos, you see them here, these colonnades with the roof over them, started here. Some believe they went all the way around. There's no way to prove that or disprove that. We do know that Solomon's portico is this first one right here. It's called Solomon's portico just to the left of the Golden Gate because they believe that at the base of that portico was one of the only stones left from Solomon's temple that Babylon hadn't destroyed. And that was this first portico here. Now, the interesting thing about the porticos on the outside, this is where all the rabbinical teachers would go and teach. So if you're the Apostle Paul and you share that you sat at the feet of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was a Rabboni, one of the master rabbis, he would have a prominent place probably somewhere in Solomon's portico where his students sat at his feet and learned from him. It was a very opportune place to teach from because of the acoustics of the roof over the stones. It made it easy for a man to teach large groups, to be heard, to speak to them, to have them sit at his feet and learn from him. So that's what these porticos were primarily used for. And based on your ranking amongst the rabbis or amongst the teachers, you had a prominent place you commonly taught. For the apostles to come in and begin to preach right at Solomon's porch, right at the portico, means that they were stepping all over the toes of some poor, nice rabbi fella. But were they interested in that? Were they interested in anything other than the audience and bringing the gospel? Good. But they knew they would get the largest number of people there and get the greatest effect in these places. And we have the disciples early on in the temple daily up until the time that the Spirit's going to come to them in Acts chapter 2. It would be in these porticos that they would be together, whether, no telling where, probably some of these outside areas that they would be praying, encouraging one another, waiting for the time that's going to come, taking care of the business that they took care of in the replacing of Judas by Matthias, etc. This would be where that would all take place. One more thing before I move on. This artist's rendition of the temple shows these little buildings on both sides of the temple complex. It is understood in the writings of Josephus that, especially on the south side, that these buildings did exist and they were apartments for the priests. So the fateful night of Jesus' arrest in the garden, and he would be brought into the city. He's going to be brought to Annas first, John tells us. Annas should have been the high priest, but at this coming day and age, priests didn't serve for life anymore. They had become a political tool of the Romans. And the Roman governors began to appoint priests that were more favorable to them. Annas had been the high priest, actually 2 before Caiaphas. Caiaphas was his son-in-law. There was a high priest appointed between Annas and Caiaphas, and then Caiaphas was appointed. Once again, as the governors came in, they wanted their own guy and someone they could work with, and they were appointing priests. All this to say, Annas would not be allowed in here because he's not the serving high priest anymore. So they would have brought Jesus to him in the city. He would have met with Annas. They'd be brought to Caiaphas in the temple. Now, if you remember, it was during the interview with Caiaphas that Peter's going to deny the Lord the third time. Remember, John had to get him where? Into the temple. It would be in these apartments on this side. And if you notice these little walls right here, well, in this courtyard in the front were these little round barrels. And these little round barrels were meant to start fires, especially during the cold seasons. And it was around one of these barrels that the people had gathered together where Peter was asked once again, aren't you one of his? And he would adamantly, cursing, deny the Lord. You remember? Okay? And Jesus, from his place in front of Caiaphas's apartment where he's being interrogated by Caiaphas, is going to look over and see Peter. And Peter's going to make eye contact with him, and he's going to be brokenhearted, knowing what the Lord had said. It would be in that south side that would take place. Kind of just an interesting imagery to give you about it. Okay, as I mentioned, here is the model in the Museum of Israel. This model is 21,500 square feet. It's a 1.5 scale model of the city based on, to the best of their ability, the reconstruction of the city with history. Okay. This, of course, would be looking down into the temple, as I mentioned, from the Mount of Olives. If you can imagine sitting on the Mount of Olives just that much higher than the city, whether it's exact or not, I couldn't tell you, but this is a similar image to the image Jesus would have sitting with his disciples looking down in when they asked him, after he said not one stone is going to be left upon the other, when will the end of this age be? They understood when he said not one stone of this building was going to be left upon another meant the end of an era, an end of a dispensation, because they knew what this represented. This represented the beating heart of the old law. And they knew with its destruction meant its removal completely. So they asked him, when will the end of this age be? This would be looking down and seeing the view that they would have. Now, if you look here, you can see the walls of the city. This would be the walls, basically, that we went through in Nehemiah chapter 3 that we pieced together piece by piece. Probably a little fortified, a little bit better fortified by this time than it was then, but yet the same walls built around. With the exception of this section here, would have been the end of that city. From here all the way out to here, all of that's new. All that northern side has been added since Nehemiah, during that 400 years between those times. It's this wall, as I mentioned, this is where the Romans would knock this wall down first. They would take this wall, they would come in and try to take this wall, and it was almost the end of them. Actually, and Titus almost died in that battle. You remember Vespasian started the destruction of Jerusalem, but when Nero died, he went back to secure the throne. Titus stayed there basically, kept the city bottled up, and he sent back approval for Titus to take the city and finish the job. Well, Titus was one of those generals, oddly enough, that always wanted to be in the front. Josephus writes on and on about him. And there was, matter of fact, it's kind of teased about in history that Josephus kind of was a little too enamored with Titus. But at any rate, Titus was probably, for his day, one of the most profound martial artists in the Roman practice of war, and liked to fight. He liked to be in the front. And he got so far ahead of his troops in the attack of that wall that he got cut off from his men. And they actually lost almost 1,000 men rescuing him, if you can imagine, trying to get to him before the enemy got to him. All of this trying to take this north wall right here. All right, so with that, you kind of get a little bit of idea of the downhill slope. This is what's referred to as the lower city. The lower city is one of the oldest parts of Jerusalem and the part where the people with the least of sustenance lived, your everyday folks. Probably also where the upper room was at, that the apostles will be in when we see them beginning in Acts chapter 2. Now somewhere, I'm going to tell you this in advance, somewhere in Acts chapter 2, in that very opening segment, they're going to transition before 9 a.m. from somewhere in this lower city into the temple compound. Because as we're going to see it, that 9 a.m. is when they're going to begin the preaching. After everybody's confounded by their tongues and the audience is gathered, they're going to begin to preach Jesus as the Christ for the very first time. But they're going to transition somewhere from the upper room to here and begin speaking in tongues and gather an audience and confuse and amaze all the people in all that one time. We'll get to that and we'll cover that more when we get into Acts chapter 2. This is the upper city. At the very back of that back wall back there, we have a better picture of it here in just a minute. is Herod's palace. Herod not only reconstructed the temple, but took pretty good care of himself too. Built a pretty nice palace, left it, of course, for his sons. Now, Herod's father, the Antipater, had made friendship with Julius Caesar. I hope everybody knows the Herods are not Jews. They're Idumeans. Idumeans are descendants of Edom, descendants of Esau. Okay, they were conquered by John Hyrcanus during the time between the Greek Syrians and the Romans. There was a little brief time of history, about 70 to 100 years, where the Jews were free from being ruled by all these nations for just a tad. Okay, during that time, they would conquer the Samaritans, bring them back under their thumb. They would conquer the Idumeans. The Jews called them Idumeans. They were the Edomites to the children of Israel, but they conquered them and brought them back into the family, if you will, at the point of a sword. Meaning, you will serve God, be circumcised, keep the commandments of Moses, or we just kill you now. You decide. So they got a choice, and they came back into the fold that way. Okay? Well, the Antipater, which was Herod the Great's father, was a politician. He served faithfully for Julius Caesar, made a friendship with him, and in kind return, Julius Caesar appointed him a lordship. He wasn't a true king. He gave him rule, if you will, in a section of what the Romans called Palestina. Palestina was a segment of Syria. Antioch of Syria, of course, was their eastern capital, which they kept their legions, etc. Palestina was a segment of that, and then the Antipater was made ruler. From the east, there was a threat by not the Persians. My mind just went to Persian now. I won't be able to get it out of my head. Parthians, thank you. The Parthians, same group of people, but now a conglomeration of them. They were Rome's greatest enemy to the east, and they would rise up, go to war against Rome, and for just a little while, they would take over Palestina, as Rome called it, Palestine, we understand it. They would take it over for just a little bit. Herod the Great, the Antipater's son, fled for his life, and through some cunning military practice as a young man, even a young man, he made it all the way back to Rome, where he befriended Octavian. Julius Caesar would be killed. Octavian and Mark Antony, the fabled story, they would vie for power for the empire. Because Herod the Great had basically taken over all of his father's interests, he still had sway over many soldiers still left in this area who were basically unloyal to anyone in particular. He pledged their loyalty to Octavian. They fought with Octavian against Mark Antony and even used their navy to help bolster his navy. And they would conquer, of course. We know Octavian would be victorious over Mark Antony, and he would go back and become Caesar. His name would be changed to Augustus, and he would make Herod king over Palestina because of his loyalty. Okay? Because of his understanding of the Jews, and because of his knowledge of their religion. Now, he was a very shrewd military man. He was a very shrewd, a little paranoid ruler, and he killed his wife and killed two of his sons because he was worried they were going to try to take over. All of this to say he was maniacal as well as shrewd. Okay? He wanted to keep Rome's favor because they, of course, supported him. But he also wanted the Jews' favor because if he had the Jews' favor, he kept Rome happy because Jerusalem and Judea in particular was the pearl of the Roman Empire, where all the other nations combined could not provide the finances in taxes that Jerusalem and Judea, Palestina basically, provided the Roman Empire for its campaigns. This they were tolerated more than any other of Roman Empire's conquered areas because of the amount of money they provided to the Roman Empire for their campaigns. And Herod knew that. And he knew if he kept the Jews happy, let's build them a temple. They'll keep paying taxes. Rome will love me. I get to rule. You get the picture, right? And this is how all of that started back up and why he's building them the temple, etc. Okay. Here's a little bit more of the depth of the city. Now, when you get outside these walls, it seems like the Museum of Israel lost interest in providing us true scale. Because we know that the Valley Kidron is out here, not Valley Kidron, Valley Gehenna is out here. And it was not a deep valley. It wasn't a gorged valley. It was a lower valley, because that is still there to this day. We do know that outside that southern wall, we talked about this when we did Nehemiah, that's where they kept the trash burning. And it was the way that the kids in Jerusalem, their parents would scare them. If you don't do your chores and if you don't study your parchments or whatever it might be, we're going to take you out to the Valley of Gehenna. It was a scary place. They kept fires burning there 365 days of the week. Smoke was always part of it, dark clouds of smoke, flies, vultures, birds of prey, maggots. I mean, it's the worst imagery you can imagine. Now you understand why Jesus used it as an inference to eternal punishment. Okay? He said, you see that? Now imagine it eternally and much worse. And now you get eternal banishment from God. Okay? That's why he used that, and that's why he uses that term. That's why your Bibles do you justice when they transliterate that. Instead of throwing the word hell in there, they use Gehenna or Gehenna fire. It's to give you, to make sure you understand the imagery. You understand how truly impressive it was. That Jesus wanted them to know that if you do not give yourself to God, that's your future. And worse. Okay? So that was the imagery for that. But this gives you a little bit of the scale of how much it dips down. This section right here is called Ophel, or the city of David. This was part of the old city. This was part of the one we looked at in Nehemiah. That although the walls had been knocked down, most of this part of the city had still remained. Some of these buildings here probably dated back even before the rebuilding of Zerubbabel. They had survived a lot of those buildings, even to this coming date. Also, it should help us to understand the scale of the city. 1/50th scale doesn't tell us a whole lot about miles. There are some people that think that the temple compound from side to side, the open compound, is anywhere from 500 to 800 yards wide. Yards. Football fields. Okay? That's how many wide it was. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the city. 250,000 year-round residents. It had to be big, right? It had to be sizable. Now remember in Nehemiah, we had 46,000 people? And that's when they were all there before some of them went back out. 46,000 versus 250,000. A lot of people lived in here. It was a well-populated city, very large for its day. There are pools here. There are pools actually up here by this north gate, the pools of Bethesda. There's a pool on the outside on this side. There's all manner of water there. You need that for that many residents, but it also gives you some idea of the logistics of baptizing 3,000 people. There was plenty of water. Okay? They didn't have to go looking very far for it. Another look from the south, looking in a little bit higher up. As I mentioned, this lower part down here, I just think they kind of built all that up and just started scaling. They weren't worried about what was on the outside as much. All right, here's another look at the porticos, their idea of the porticos, if you will, of the colonnades, whether it was one stack, two stack, we don't know for sure, but it does give you an idea that they went in with some depth. The acoustics in there would have been very good, especially with the stone. Would have been very easy for them to teach and share and preach and do all the things necessary for the education of both the children of Israel under the rabbis, or Christians, as they would spend, the apostles would spend numerous hours in there teaching Christians. Go ahead, Mary. This is not. This is the inside of the temple and the colonnades. Now, there were markets. I do have a really nice picture of the market. I didn't bring it in with these because it's really not in the story. Now, when we get to Corinth, I have pictures of the agora there because that is important to the story, and much of Paul's work would be done in the agora in Corinth, but I don't have them for here. But they did have a large market area. They also had, I think we talked about it in Nehemiah. Let me see if I have hang on. Nope, that's that's not going to do me any good. Hang on. I'll come back. That might give me a little better idea. So on the north side up here, these walls way up here on the north was the sheep gate. You remember the sheep gate? That's the gate that all, especially for Passover, all the lambs would have been brought into the city through that gate. Some 230,000 lambs butchered in those few hours right before the end of that 15th day of the month of Nisan. They would bring them in, they would butcher all those sheep for Passover so everybody would have a meal. We not hearing bells? Was one? You're kidding me. All right, sorry. I was caught up in this, I guess not paying attention. All right. Wow, that went by fast. But the markets would have been on that north side. There would be older markets in the south side of the city. This, by the way, is the Fortress Antonio. And I will stop here and we'll pick up with the Fortress Antonio next week. That's going to become a very important part of our story. We'll take a hard look at this when we get to Acts chapter 21. Go ahead and read some of Acts chapter 21 if you want in preparation for it. This is Paul's arrest. This finds him taken out of the temple and the doors shut, and then him being beaten until the Roman garrison gets to him, and he's not even going to be able to walk as they drag him up to the steps of this fortress, okay, where he's then going to be able to give a defense of himself for the first time to all those people. We'll talk about that next week and get ready to get into chapter 2. Thank you. That went by too fast.